If a snail and the Russian army started at the same point in 2022, today that snail would reach the Polish border, while the Russians are still stuck in the Donbass. And that's because this has been an incredibly slow war. And this from an army that thought they could take this country in 3 days. And here, 3.5 years later, they're still fighting in the fields in the east and the south. But it's slower than it even sounds, because this didn't even start in 2022. It started in 2014, when something happened behind me. And that's that Ukraine decided that they'd had enough of corruption. They'd had enough of a president in Putin's pocket. And so they looked west. They looked west to the EU, to NATO, to democracy, and they decided to protest. And while Ukrainians looked west, their leader looked east to Moscow, and that is where he fled.
The country's ousted president is now in Russia.
And that's the moment that Putin realized he couldn't control Ukraine anymore, that he couldn't have this country under a puppet state. And that is why he stole Crimea and stormed the Donbass. And what Putin did next is he waited. He waited to see Western reaction, to the reaction from democratic nations. And the reaction was this. It was Angela Merkel congratulating him opening the Nord Stream pipeline, because democratic Western countries don't understand that there's a new axis forming on Earth right now, an axis that's not united by ideology, but united by a hatred of rule of law and democracy. And that is North Korea, it's Iran, it's China, it's Russia. And so while this axis slowly formed in the background, an axis designed to destabilize democracies from the inside and destroy them from the outside, we were oblivious, and Western leaders didn't think what Putin would do next. And that's why Putin tried to storm this capital. In 2022, his convoy headed towards this city, and it was filled with uniforms with Victory Day badges. One of my friends even has one from the blown out convoy. But he didn't decide to stop. That's why they're still fighting in the fields every single day. He decided to change his tactic, to flood our airwaves with more misinformation, to try and convince the world that Ukraine isn't worth supporting. And to an extent, it worked. It slowed down shipments of help to this country. But this isn't a new threat. This has been happening for decades. And someone that knows more than almost anyone else is Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Anne Applebaum. She's just written a new book called Autocracies Incorporated. So I wanted to know when all this started, what it means, and where it's all going.
So you've written extensively recently about how Autocracy Incorporated, it's a global network of regimes designed to undermine democracy, collaborating together, working together. I want to ask you what you think Russia's war in Ukraine plays as a role in that system. Is it just a symptom, or is it a spearhead in that system? How involved actually is that?
So you're right. Russia is part of a group of countries who have come to identify the language of democracy as a threat to them personally. So they see talk of rights, human rights, transparency, accountability, rule of law, independent courts. All of that comes from their own oppositions, and they hear it in their own countries, and they see it as a threat to them and their style of rule. They're people who seek to rule without checks and balances, without any impediments, without criticism, without legitimate opposition, at least not one that they haven't orchestrated. When Russia began, first of all in 2014, but even more so in 2022, began contemplating the war in Ukraine, one of the things that they hoped to do was to undermine those ideas. And let me explain what I mean. Ukraine in 2014, actually first in 2005, and then again in 2014, had been a country where there were these big movements in favor of, again, transparency, accountability, rights, and a more democratic political system. And in Ukraine, those movements were very explicitly against Russian influence and against Russian domination. Putin understood them as threatening not just for the leaders of Ukraine, but also for himself. He understood that he was threatened by similar kinds of movements using similar kinds of language, because they were exactly the kind of political movement that won the Revolution of Dignity in Ukraine in 2014. He's afraid of that kind of movement in Russia. And so the invasion of Ukraine was meant to, first of all, destroy Ukraine. Second of all, to fulfill a kind of imperial dream he has of recreating the Russian Empire, but also to show that the world of these ideas, the world of rule of law, international law, the UN Charter, the Geneva Conventions, that all that stuff doesn't exist. It's not real, and he can just ignore it. He can do whatever he wants. He can break whatever laws he wants. He can break any rules he wants, and he can do it with impunity, and nobody can stop him. And I think actually in 2022, I think he believed he would do it with impunity. He thought nobody would fight back, and he believed his own propaganda about Ukraine. He thought Ukraine would fall apart. But the goal was, and I think still remains, to undermine the democratic world and undermine the rule of law language, especially to break apart Europe and European institutions, the European Union, NATO, and so on. So it's, for him, this is very much part of his war against Western ideas, or the democratic world's ideas. Let's not use the word West anymore. And he sees it as it's kind of the military end of his strategy. And of course, there are other parts of the strategy too, but this is the kind of sharp end of that strategy.
Do you think he thinks he's going to succeed with this? Because you understand the psychology of Putin's mind and dictators' minds like him. Do you think he thinks he's going to win and he's going to take all of Ukraine and carry on to the Baltics?
So my guess is that he did think that in 2022. I'm sure he thought that in 2022. I think he then entertained some doubt, especially in the autumn of that year when the Russian army began losing territory. Even throughout 2023, when the Ukrainian counteroffensive happened and failed, he still was on the back foot. My fear about him now is that since Trump's election, he came to think that Trump would weaken the Western coalition, the Democratic coalition, that Trump would no longer help Ukraine. Trump is also helping the Russians in various other ways. He's in effect beginning to lift sanctions. He's also stopped funding for independent media in Russia and other causes that bothered Putin a lot. And I think Putin has come to believe in the last few months that maybe he can win. I think he's wrong, actually, but the mood changed in Moscow with the U.S. election.
How much do you think authoritarian regimes are learning from each other right now?
I think they learn from one another all the time. I think they, by the way, is a large group. It's not just Russia and China. It's Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, Azerbaijan, a host of countries in Africa, Mali. They watch what one another does. In some cases, there's deliberate learning. So, for example, the Wagner Group in Africa has taught people how to do disinformation. And has taught people what's the right language to use to fight back against the ideas of rule of law. But they watch and they learn and they pick up one another's narratives. I mean, there's an example of this that I give in my book, Autocracy, Inc., which was at the very beginning of the Ukraine war. There was a very elaborately staged false story about so-called biolabs. These were meant to be biological weapons laboratories in Ukraine and somehow their presence was supposed to muddy the story, like maybe the Americans were helping the Ukrainians build biological weapons or something like that. It was not actually that clear. And they began talking about biolabs. And they actually got the Chinese to pick up the narrative about biolabs, and the Chinese put it out on their Chinese state media all over Africa, all over Asia. The Iranians were talking about biolabs. The Venezuelans were talking about biolabs. So they take specific stories from one another, and they also take techniques. So I have no doubt, by the way, that Iranians learned from Russian social media. They learned how to use it to manipulate their opposition. So they infiltrate it. They use fake accounts to seem like opposition who aren't, and so on. I mean, all those are Russian tactics from a long way back. And that they've picked up probably mostly by watching it rather than by direct instruction.
Do you think that Western leaders understand the actual threat that this bloc faces to all of us, to democracy, to our institutions? Or do you think we're moving way too slowly? I mean, how far are we at understanding this?
I think some Western leaders understand some of it, and some are better than others. But as a whole, you have to say, the leaders of Europe are behind the curve. They're behind the curve in understanding how much Russia hates them and how much it's not just about Ukraine, it's about them. I mean, I think actually the war in Ukraine is mostly about them, in that it's mostly about Europe and wanting to undermine the power of Europe and the unity of Europe and the idea of Europe, which is still appealing to so many Russians. I don't think they fully understand that. Some understand the social media game better than others, but many don't understand it at all. And I think many have also underestimated the threat, not so much this is not from the U.S. government, but the power of the American far right, which I think also is now aimed very much at Europe and European institutions as well, and including some European governments. And they've underestimated all of those threats. And they tend to imagine it's just about better messaging or something, where I think the arguments are more fundamental. If you look at U.S. politics now, a lot of arguments aren't anymore about policy. And you can see some people in the political world still trying to make arguments about policy. Our policies are better than their policies, therefore we should win the election. And they haven't understood the degree to which debates have now shifted to culture war and identity, and that they need to, and that's partly under the influence of the Russians, who understood how powerful those things were, and that they need to shift the way they argue. So I think they've not caught up yet to maybe just even to the scale of Russian and Chinese ambition.
Do you think we'll realize too late?
I hope not. There is a learning curve happening, and you can hear it. Even the current German chancellor talks very differently from the previous German chancellor. Actually, I think Keir Starmer probably understands a lot of these things better than he sometimes articulates. Macron is very changed from what he was, a few years back. So no, they are learning, and they are beginning to understand the threat. And you can point also to countries who have always understood it, like Sweden or Finland, or the Baltic states or Poland. So it's not hopeless, but there is something like a lack of ability to work together collectively. And that's, of course, not only on this issue, it's on many issues, that the Europeans as a group aren't yet able to articulate singular policies. I'm hoping that changes.
Yeah, and what does that look like? Because, I've been speaking to lots of journalists and people that are based here, and they say they feel like World War III has already started in terms of having an allied and an Axis coalition.
I think there needs to be a European army. It could be a volunteer army. It could have soldiers in it from countries that don't really have armies. There are a lot of people in places like Denmark or the Netherlands who might like to be in a real army. It would need an actual army that could be deployed. It would need I know there's endless conversations about this in NATO, and we're at a transition moment and so on, but it would need a unified European defense industry that builds weapons together and isn't totally dependent on the United States, for example, for satellite technology and intelligence. So we would need a European intelligence network. We would also need institutions that exist already, like the European Commission, which has the ability to regulate social media. We would need them to begin to act and to begin to have a clear voice in making sure that social media platforms are transparent, because right now they're not. We don't really know how algorithms work. We don't know who they're favoring and not favoring. We don't know how they're affecting the politics of our countries. These are, from the European perspective, these are foreign companies based either in the US or, in the case of TikTok, in China. And yet we have allowed them to use their algorithms in ways that we don't understand. And so enforcing transparency would be just the first step in understanding how our media system really works. But creating European alternatives to that. I can see, a European media space emerging that's different. Beginning to think about how those companies are effectively controlling and manipulating our conversation. I'd like to hear more conversation about that. You might also, you have, to some extent, you have European coordination on trade. That's maybe the only area where the European Union is really powerful. But you might have to begin also to think a little bit about European industrial policy. Is there a case for more European drone companies, for example, that involve more countries and maybe some EU input? You need to begin to think as a continent in terms of continental security, both information security as well as military security.
To what extent do you think that we've paid for our own demise? You've written again in your book about how law firms, companies, organizations have basically also collaborated with and propped up authoritarian regimes, places like Russia. I talk endlessly about the Nord Stream pipeline and the disaster that caused, and how European countries are basically paying for their own invasion, right? We buy Russian gas, and Russians use that to pay Russian soldiers and to pay the salaries of North Korean soldiers to kill people here in this country and to kill Europeans. To what extent does that rot go to, and how deep do you think that actually is?
It goes very deep, because it goes back 3 decades, actually. It goes back to decisions that were made in the 90s when people wrongly assumed that Russia would be a kind of ally of Europe forevermore, and therefore it was safe to build these dependencies on oil and gas and other kinds of trade. We have a little more complicated with China, but we also have a complicated relationship with them in which it's more of a trading relationship in which that we're also very dependent on right now. And of course, they're less directly threatening to our security, but they could be threatening down the line. That relationship of dependency has already been unpicked to some degree. The fact that those pipelines aren't running the way they did, not least because one of them was blown up, but is a testament to that. But again, getting Europe to focus on how to completely disentangle itself from Russian gas and how to pull the remainder of its companies out of Russia is, I think, the next stage of the conflict or the next stage of the story. I mean, as you know, there's a complication there, which is that the Hungarians and the Slovaks are blocking a lot of that effort. And I'm hoping actually that under the Danish presidency, the EU begins to look for ways around them.
You've written quite a lot recently about the dangers of nostalgia as well, and how authoritarian regimes use myth and nostalgia to rewrite history. Do you think that can be undone? And they use it to justify everything they're doing. Do you think that's something that can carry on forever in the days of social media, or is this just going to continue forever?
I'm actually hoping that this stupid cycle, which is, by the way, not just authoritarian. I mean, you get it from the American far right, you get it from the British far right, you get it from the Polish far right as well. I'm hoping that this cycle is undone by the next generation. I mean, a lot of this is coming from people whose lifetimes have experienced an enormous amount of change. So if you grew up in a village in southern Poland or eastern France or Ohio over 50 years ago, then it's true that the world you grew up in and the kind of small town life that you remember, where everybody went to the same church on Sunday and so on, it's gone. And so part of what you're seeing is, I think, a feeling of people in their 50s and 60s, really, but maybe even a little younger, feeling some kind of lack, or we're deprived or something is missing, some lack of, and some lack of. They don't see a future in modernity, and I'm really counting on people in their 20s to reverse that. To say, this is the world, we live in the digital world, we're going to take ownership of it, and this is what we want the future to look like. And I think once we get a generation of people in politics who are focused on the future and not on the past, and who are able to see a positive way forward and aren't always looking backwards to build something that probably never was the way they thought it was anyway, then we'll be a lot better off.
I kind of want to finish as well talking about what you think is going to happen in Ukraine. I remember reading interviews with you saying that you weren't surprised when Putin tried to take this city, Kyiv, in 2022, that you predicted this was going to happen. But what do you think is going to happen next, tangibly unfolding?
I don't like to make direct predictions because, one has to be very careful. In the case of this war, a lot depends on what the US does, which is pretty unpredictable, what Europe does, which is still unpredictable, what the mood is in Ukraine over the next year, which is also unpredictable. My guess is that Putin can't win. He certainly can't take Ukraine by force. He can't occupy Ukraine. I think even what I think is his secondary sort of plan B, which is to put some kind of pro-Russian figure in charge of the government and get rid of Zelensky somehow, or get rid of his successors and put somebody else in. I even think that's going to prove to be impossible, because Ukraine has just been through too much in the last 3 years. And I just don't think Ukrainians will accept a pro-Russian government of any kind. And so I think he's going to lose. I'm just worried about how long it will take. This is a colonial war, and colonial wars usually last about a decade. If you look at France and Algeria, for example, there's a kind of period, essentially there's a revolution that needs to happen in Moscow in order for this to change. And the revolution it doesn't have to be political change or regime change. There has to be an understanding that the war is a waste of time and that it's unnecessary and it can't be won. And as I said, I thought we were getting to that, a year or so ago. I'm worried that the election of Trump has dampened it down. I'm hoping that over the next few months, it will revive itself. We need to get to this moment when the Russians understand that it's a waste of time, it's a waste of lives, and it can't be won. Look at what happened with France and Algeria. It's a very interesting story if you go back and reread it, which I did a couple of years ago. There's a moment when de Gaulle decides that we're just not fighting this war anymore. And this is a moment of huge turbulence in Paris. There's like an attempted coup d'etat, and they try to assassinate him. And there's a bunch of generals in the army who never really accept that they've lost Algeria. But it does eventually happen. And that's the transformation we have to get to in Russia. I do think it will happen. I just hope it's not too far away, and I hope we don't have to see too much of Ukraine or even Europe destroyed before that happens.
I've been looking a lot into the Soviet mindset as well, and I've kind of come to the conclusion that Russians at all levels of society are indifferent to this war. They were indifferent in 2014. They were indifferent in 2022. I went to Kursk, I went to Suja. I spoke to Russians physically when I was there. Illegally, and I asked them what they thought about the invasion, and they said they were annoyed because they couldn't get cell phone signal, but they couldn't really care less about what was actually happening here.
Let me just say there's a positive side to that. The flip side of that is if Putin were to announce tomorrow that the war is over, and I don't know what excuse he gives, it doesn't really matter, they would also not care.
That's true.
So it's not as if there would be massive objections to him ending the war. Nor do I believe would there be a massive objection to a change of leader in Russia. If you look at what happened, there's a very good example of exactly what you were talking about. If you remember Prigozhin's march into the city of Rostov, yes, and then his march to Moscow, when he came into Rostov, I mean, these were like guys on military vehicles, fully armed. They parked themselves in the middle of Rostov and they occupied the military headquarters of the city, basically. And there was no public reaction. I mean, a few people came down and cheered on the mercenaries and bought them ice cream and bottles of water. And that was it. A violent military force had just come to occupy their city, and they were fine with it.
So the indifference is also can be the other way.
Right. So while it means there's a lot of indifference, it also means that were Putin to disappear next week, also they would be fine. So it's indifference to everything, to the war, but also to any other change. Also, one other caveat: I would be really careful about interpreting anything that Russians say in public to you or to anyone. And remember that there is no such thing as a public sphere in Russia. There's no normal forum for debate, and it's not okay to have different opinions and debate them and discuss them. You are meant to do what you're told to do, and people know that it's dangerous to say anything different. And so the people's willingness to talk or their willingness to object or even their willingness to spend the time to think about it is very limited. So it's not that meaningful what they say now. It's not you're not having very deep conversations. That's the only thing I would be careful of.
Interesting. No, I agree with you, actually. I think that makes a lot of sense. You've written extensively about the threats that are now unfolding for decades. What gives you hope about all of this? What's the main thing that you think will sort of be the solution to a lot of this? What gives you hope about what's going to happen next?
So people always ask me this, and I've come to see the question as almost it's almost a problem, because what gives you hope, what creates hope, is doing stuff, and I see a lot of people around who are engaged in trying to build something in their communities, or I see people who are trying to create new kinds of media online like you're doing, or people who are moved to act to do something to help Ukraine or to do something to benefit others in their communities who are suffering. In the US, there's now a huge problem with both legal and illegal, actually, I'd say, immigrants feeling discriminated against. So hope is something that comes from action and from creativity. And so if you want to feel hope, you should do something. And so me telling you what should make you feel better is useless. It's you doing things that will create hope and create some kind of different future.
That is such a wonderful note to end on. And this has been amazing. I have wanted to speak to you for so many years, so I really appreciate your time and your analysis on what's going on. Your latest book is amazing. I'll put the link in the description to buy that below. And do you think we've covered everything? Is there anything else you want to say?
I mean, we could go on, but I think that's probably enough for one conversation.
I hope you enjoyed this report. If you liked watching this, please hit subscribe and also comment and let me know what you think and what you'd like me to cover in future. I read every single comment and love the feedback and community here. In the next couple of days, I'll be going to the front lines of Ukraine to bring on-the-ground reports about new Russian advances. It looks like in the last few days they're surrounding cities like Pokrovsk, and things are changing at a bit of a different pace. So I'm going to be getting an on-the-ground report and publishing it here on this channel. So if you want to see that and you want to see what I'll be up to in future, hit subscribe and I'll see you next time.